Well, good afternoon, Adrian, and thank you very much for giving me your time this afternoon to come and talk to us. As you well know, the Democracy Commission has been set up by Kirklees Council. It's part of a wider review looking at the new council and other things, which highlights that Kirklees' reputation as being one of the most proactive councils in the country has been underlined. And I think it's always refreshing, working for the University of Huddersfield, to have such a civically minded institution so close to me. Has made my working life much more enjoyable and more rich. In many ways, the Democracy Commission has been set up due to some well-established questions around that changing realignment of citizen and local government, but also in terms of electoral turnout, concerns about political disengagement. But it's also driven by very unique circumstances that we seem to be experiencing in the autumn of 2016, post-EU referendum and the fallout from that. And obviously the ongoing reordering of the constitutional architecture, not only of the United Kingdom, but of England. And in many ways that's raising some very interesting questions. I think one of the things that is most laudable about what Kirklees is doing and having prepared to hold this commission is that they are thinking in ways which central government aren't. If we look at the devolution agenda and the idea of devolution to city regions or combined authorities, there's been very clear consideration of the implications on local government, in particular local democracy. And in that sense, having you here today is very valuable because not only in your role as Chief Executive of Kirklees Council, but in a wider role in the discussions about devolution in West Yorkshire, or whatever that may be, you have a considerable influence. And in that way, to sort of start off, I think that considering about this sense of lack of consideration about the implications of devolution, of regional devolution on local democracy, do you have any thoughts about what you think that reordering and that passing of power to a combined authority is going to have for the role of councils in Kirklees?
So, Andrew, yes, I do. I guess it's at two levels. I think there is an issue around devolution in terms of how a Kirklees councillor influences what a sub-regional agenda, whatever the geography of that looks like. That's in one direction. I think, though, hand in hand with that goes the devolution that's necessary from Kirklees Council to very local areas in terms of making that work. So I don't actually think you can talk about one without the other. But I'll certainly start with the regional dimension of devolution. So I think that the first thing that it requires, if power is going to be drawn down from government to a sub-regional level or to a regional level, is it requires districts to be clear what their priorities are, so that they can interface well with both the powers and money which are drawn down from a national level. Because otherwise, without being clear about what those priorities are, actually you can't have a long-term view and relationship about what the benefits for the district are going to be. And so for a district like Kirklees, which is very many different communities, towns, villages, actually establishing those overall priorities in a way which resonates with all the towns, all of the political parties, is actually quite a difficult thing to do. So the first thing I think sub-regional devolution requires is a level of clarity around strategies and plans, and most importantly benefits for local people, which is shared in large parts across the council chamber. So I'll just leave that thought, you might want to come back to it. And that's why I say it goes hand in hand with being clear about what power is exercised at the quite local level, because I think there's a relationship and trade-off between being clear at a high level and then being clear to work with and shape and broker what's needed in individual communities.
Do you think that Kirklees at the moment is establishing the certainties about those things we talk about these kind of priorities?
So yes, I do. I wouldn't I? So in the context of new council, in the context of being really clear that economic resilience is one of the cross-cutting drivers that enables well-being and wealth on one hand, and the health and well-being of our population as the other major driver, and then being clear that early intervention in all of those things, working with communities so that the demand for services reduces in the longer term. Easy to say, quite something else to pull off. I think that is established as the principles for new council. The devil, though, is in the detail. So actually one of our challenges is how to engage councillors in what that means at the next level down. How much of that is consistent across the whole district, and how much of it is determined by local circumstance, local need, and the views of local populations.
Because one of the things that's come up here has been, in a sense, as we've gone around the various parts of Kirklees talking to different groups of people, there does seem to be asymmetries in the way that the citizenry understands, that councillors understand their own roles in that. Do you think that councillors have a clear understanding of their role in this?
It depends what you mean by "in this" is.
Sorry, yes,
I think
in the sense of engaging with, understanding what their priorities are, number one, what the key priorities are, and then in the way in which they interact and transmit those two.
So I think there are shared values amongst councillors around what's important in being a local councillor. I'm equally clear there are a number of very different views about what being a good councillor means. So I think there is for me a very clear, and it's always been there, but growing need for councillors to be community brokers and community leaders at two levels. One in the sense of their ward and their local place, and two in the context of what that means for the whole district and indeed the district's place in the sub-region. I think for me that's the fundamental bedrock, and to some degree I think all councillors would share that view, but it is to some degree. There is also, though, a piece about representative democracy, which is about setting that agenda and taking important decisions on behalf of the population, which can have a tension between that local community leadership role. And I think where different councillors place the emphasis on that spectrum can vary massively. And I think you could get 69 different answers to where that balance lies, but I think those are shared values about where the spectrum is.
We certainly have it.
For me, the crucial role is the community engagement, community brokering, and being able to distill what that means for the district as well as for individual councillors' casework.
That's a change in role in many ways, to become more of an enabler, a facilitator, if you want to put it in those terms. It does seem in our interactions with the general public to go against their view, the dominant view about what a council is, which is more of a representative, more of a traditional model, representative both in terms of their ward and in terms of their political party. And so that tension you describe seems to be manifesting itself in the perceptions of what a role of a councillor is. How do you think that Kirklees Council could communicate to citizens about this sense of your perception of change in the role and the way in which they might reassess their relationship with local councils?
So the way we're trying to do that is in a spirit of co-production through a number of different programmes. So, for example, the Cities of Service programme that we're running, which the fit between models from the States and the UK is far from perfect, but the sense of corporate citizenship between businesses and local communities. So we're running some programmes around that. We've been very proactive for a long time in seeking to find ways of involving local communities in decision making. But I think the real dilemma for me is, and this may not be the Commission's experience, but when people talk about representative democracy, they quite often mean doing what I want. So there's a real history of pressure group representative democracy in Kirklees. Now that's not the same, to my mind, as representative democracy. democracy, which is more like what I was talking about earlier. And I think that's at the heart of the dilemma.
Yeah.
It's an individual view that says my councillor should do what I want, and I'm right. And so that's why I come back to the community broking piece, because there is a bit before that says actually what is the shared and collective view of what the right thing to do is.
It is something that has come up in much of our work, is this role of civil society in between the individual and the elected representative. And that experience seems to be enormously varied across Kirklees. In some senses, how do you broker and how do you bring that civil society element into the conversation without disturbing the relationship between the individual and the elected representative? Do you think it's resolvable, or is it just simply a facet of Kirklees democracy?
So I do tend to think it's a facet of Kirklees democracy, because it's a facet of different populations, different communities, different towns, different villages, and the way that maps across into party politics and sometimes just individual political philosophy. So I think the tension is inevitable. I don't think it's unresolvable, and I do think that it has to be through community broking and co-production and a conversation about what's important, you know, and actually at what level you try to resolve issues. And coupled with the fact that I think, and I have to make very clear these are all personal views, not my view as Chief Executive of the Council, but there's a very long history of legislation taking us to places that aren't quite what was intended. And actually unpicking some of that locally and saying what does it make sense to do, how are we going to do it, is the representative democracy piece. Whereas what matters around here, what is the base level of what matters to local folk in this place, is the brokering bit, and I think the trick's in the middle.
It is again, I think that Kirklees is to be congratulated, asking the difficult questions around the changing nature of that relationship. Councillor?
Yeah, probably going back a bit, one of the discussions we had this morning with Andrew Taylor was about, given that we're going to get stuff dissolved to the city region, looking below that, what's a basic building block for local government, that community engagement, and what resources does it need? So even at ward level or a sub-ward level.
So I think the first resource it needs is a level of ambition and development for councillors that recognises that they're at the forefront of that engagement, and that's the way in which they become the legitimate voice of feeding into the city region level. I think that will need a level of support from the council as a whole, but there's any number of ways of organising that. I think the first trick is to recognise that councillors will need support, but I think we get the wrong way round. I think officers go out to find out what communities want sometimes and then come back to talk to councillors about their view of that. I think councillors have to be at the forefront of that dialogue and come back and be really clear about both the evidence base and their views about what needs to be done.
I had a question. So, what would you like to see councillors doing to actually make this transition, or not transition, but actually to make this new model of working more beneficial for citizens, employees of the council and the council itself?
So I think one of the things we could do between us is to create a forum in which a discussion can take place about where the common priorities are between different communities across the district. And I think sometimes that conversation gets very competitive about resources for my place, as opposed to where is the common need and solutions, where councillors across sometimes across party lines, but sometimes importantly within political groups can have a distinctive view about how that comes together and works. But the very first point of that, Gemma, would be councillors wanting to have that conversation, recognising you're all really busy and have got, pressures that aren't to do with being a councillor. That's the thing about being an officer, you can do it full time. So I think it's about making a space, but it's also an agreement that that's a conversation that's worth having. And I don't think we've got that agreement. The Democracy Commission is a great way into it, but something needs to follow.
Which is the age-old thing, how do you engage people from everywhere that aren't typically coming forward to engage?
And I guess if I have a worry for the Democracy Commission is that it could be seen as turning into what is the right way of doing decision making in Kirklees, and I think that's important, but it's not the main point. Not for me anyway.
No, that's very true. It's very true. It's interesting. I'll go on to another question. But there was a report by Conservative MP Alex Shelbrooke published last week on local government in England, and he suggested, you were talking about the part-time nature of councils. The councils should be fewer of them, and they should be full-time. They should be paid, I think, about £37,000 a year. Do you think that would be a positive or a less positive development to actually professionalise them in those terms?
Well, I think there are a mix of councillors now. We have some full-time councillors now, in the sense that they spend the majority of their time on council business. I think that comes back to the distinction I was making between representative democracy and community brokering. Because I don't think a full-time professional politician could do community brokering. They would automatically become their focus would be in the interests of the body corporate and the organisation.
It would change that relationship.
And it would change the relationship. So I think there is something about thinking about different sorts of council, but people need to be able to move between the two. Because whatever form of decision making we have, it would be very difficult to properly engage 69 or indeed 50 or 45 councillors on an equal basis in doing that. But there is a real need to have all councillors in that community brokering role, or a smaller number of professional or full-time councillors couldn't do the rest of it. That's particularly true, I think, coming back to your question about regional devolution, because if all that means is taking money and power from Whitehall and concentrating it in one person's hands in a large area, they can't connect to where those resources and powers can have best effect.
That's interesting. I was going to move on to that.
But I certainly wouldn't support full-time professional councillors. I think it would completely miss the point about
change them.
Yeah.
Could we just do a bit more? Again, you're talking about the shared values, and particularly talked about the economic resilience and linking with health and well-being.
Yep.
And perhaps they're changing it, and feeling that councillors don't always, we're looking at it anyway. In what way could a councillor's role change, and what skills do they need to do to make sure that the outcomes that they want for their communities feed in to that? Really things that the councillors could be doing, or ways the council could support the councillor to do that?
So I think the first thing that would enable that is a real clarity on outcomes at a corporate and council-wide level. I think local government has been founded on the provision of services according to statutes. It's increasingly become about community leadership and stitching those services together in a way that makes a real difference locally. But I think there's another logic jump, which is to say actually these are the outcomes that really matter. And there's several ways of pulling those together. The first is evidentially based consideration by professionals of inequalities and jobs and labour markets, but then there's a crucial bit which is about local councillor intelligence on how that manifests itself in a place and with local people. So there's that level of outcome at which we have to get that level in the first.
So supporting councillors with the intelligence that's available, that will provide them with information.
It would, but we have to have it first in order to make it available to councillors. I think that's the new council officer piece, which is having that intelligence. The second piece is making it much more accessible to councillors, not just through meetings, but on the web and cut different ways, and at different tiers of geography and in different sorts of places. And that's very much what a commissioning focus to a council should be about.
Just sort of go back and think about this process. It's a sort of dual process, the process of regional devolution down to combined authority level, and then obviously localism, which has certainly been a central tenet of our coalition and the Conservative government since 2010. There is a view that both these approaches can potentially be seen as actually somehow disempowering local authority, because decision making is going to be taken up to a certain meta level, and often localism seems to at least be somehow trying to circumvent or navigate local authorities to pass power down to local communities. And in that context, what do you think the implications are for local democracy, that sense in which citizens are voting for particular individuals or political parties, and the Kirklees Council as an institution has a democratic role? Do you think that these two overlapping but clearly distinctive policy initiatives are having an implication on the role and resonance of Kirklees Council as a democratic institution?
So it shouldn't, is my view, because the combined authority, certainly in West Yorkshire as formed, is a collaboration of district councils, and the Leeds City Region Enterprise Partnership is a public-private partnership which has said local authority leaders on it. So in terms of money coming down at the moment, it comes to people who are elected or appointed from those different district councils. So I know that's just a statement of the way it works, but it actually needs those leaders to behave then in a different way when they're collaborating from the way which is my place first, last and different. It needs some shared objectives and values at that level as well. I think there are real issues about what happens if you put a particular form of devolution in. So, for example, mayoral devolution, which actually could destabilise that relationship. The position, I'm sure, Andrew, you know, that Kirklees Council as a whole took was to welcome devolution, to accept having a mayor, and my words, but if we really have to, but only in the context that there is then a new mechanism to connect local councillors with that new democratic, so an assembly, in other words, that isn't just about scrutinising what others do. I think that if that were ever to come about, and it looks increasingly less likely, but if that were to come about, there would need to be real clarity about the mechanism by which the Assembly members related to local councillors in a local government context. Not least looking at the position in London, where the Assembly and the members of London boroughs doesn't appear to be a marriage made in heaven, let's put it like that.
Delicately put.
And there are as well only so many people around, even in a vibrant democracy, who want to put themselves forward, who want to run the electoral gauntlet, who have got the ambition and the motivation actually to keep doing that for the long term. So I think it would need clarity about how district councillors, assembly members relate to each other and what their respective roles are, even if sometimes those people would be the same folk.
So a clarity that is so far absent in much you would say,
Well, but I would expect it to be absent at this point. But I think so far devolution is based on the subsidiarity principle, that the things that are best done at a district level are done at district level. You collaborate where it makes sense to collaborate, either because there are outcomes that are shared or because there's money you can get your hands on that you couldn't otherwise get your hands on. And I think that works.
Yes. Does seem to have a very powerful effect. And in some ways, what this sort of raises, in the midst of all this shifting of the governmental tectonic plates, if you want to call it that, is the citizen. And that relationship between the citizen and the local authority and the citizen and whatever bodies are emerging seems to be becoming increasingly complex to the point that it may well disorientate some citizens. How can that be addressed? How can both Kirklees and the combined authority communicate better how this relationship is changing, and also then what are the contact points for certain services, for certain elements of provision of public life to the citizen? Because at the moment, one of the things that we do see is there's a lot of confusion about this.
Yeah, and I think it's an almost impossible tale in its complexity to tell at the moment in a simple way. It simply isn't accessible. And I think there's an increasing divergence between young people who live in an information age, and the information is out there if they're interested for them to work their way through it. And people like me who have got, to some degree proficient in that information age, but it isn't ever the way we're going to think, and we're going to want to work through personal relationships and experience to get messages. And I think the answer to your question is actually being really good at both of those. I think the dilemma for councillors is that, just speaking bluntly, there are more of them in my camp than there are in the camp from the information age, and therefore it's actually quite difficult for them to articulate how people can best get complex information on the web, through Twitter and Facebook and everything else. And actually the stages that are going to come beyond that. So what can we do to get it better? We can get our councillors as au fait as they can be with the new ways of sharing intelligence and information, as well as having as clear a message as we can have on something which is really complicated.
Just sort of wind that out, because obviously there is a question. It's generational to a certain extent. It's also one of training, etc., in the way in which council education programs are developed. But go back to this role of the citizen and the way the citizen understands not only questions of governance, accountability, but also decision making. And in our work, one of the things that has materialised has been a genuine confusion, not only amongst citizens, but also amongst other stakeholders where we might have found, we would have thought they would have a better understanding of it. And I wonder whether you could say a few words on how that can be better communicated so that citizens have a better understanding, and considering what's happening in the localism agenda and in the regional devolution development, what is the best model that Kirklees could adopt in terms of its own structures to meet these new demands?
So I think it depends to some degree on which bits they're not clear about, because my assumption would be that actually they're clearer about accountability than they are about decision making and governance. So I think at a simple level, most people in Kirklees, if you asked them who is the person you would go to get something sorted out, would say my local councillor.
Or local MP.
Well, that's a whole different issue. Now, my guess would be that MPs come in more where local people see market failure and they don't think they're getting a response from their local councillor. Although it's true to say that there is an awful lot of casework from MPs which is basically councillor business.
This is what we're sort of been finding.
But sometimes there's a confusion in the terminology, because I occasionally get people get in touch with me because I'm they think I'm their local MP,
yeah,
and they don't understand me. who do we need to get in touch with? That's happened on Facebook. Who do we need to get in touch with? And then it's just sometimes a confusion about. We know we're elected, but.
So I think, and the other dilemma is, I think people go to MPs for more complex issues. We don't get much MP interest other than generated by the media on, universal services. It tends to be much more around complex things, around, adults, children's, immigration, other things where it's complicated and people need help navigating it through. So, I hear absolutely what you say, but I don't think rationally people should be too confused between the role of an MP and the role of the council, and not least because MPs, whilst they're here for 2 or 3 days a week, aren't here all of the time, and that's what that's what people would find. I think the governance, though, is horribly complicated because it is. We are very over-governed in the UK in terms of democratic or not democratic structures. A world in which you have police and crime commissioners, which are different to elected mayors, in some places county councils, district councils and parish councils, in other places unitary authorities and metropolitan councils. A world in which you have 3 levels of local NHS, some of which interfaces with local government and some of which don't. I won't go on, but I could go on for another 10 minutes, as you all know. That's just too complicated. So I think in a way the question's wrong. We have to try and de-simplify that as best we can, but the basic building block should be a local councillor. And in a world where there's less money, that's why I say the community broking role is at the front edge of. People got used to saying, I've got a problem, you the council sort it out. When the community broking role is very much about, we've got a problem, we the people will sort it out. And the council will be appropriately involved in that. So I think, the answer is to declutter it and be clear about the balance between national and local democracy, and then have the right institutions. Our role just has to be to best explain it as we can. And I think explaining the structures is the wrong way of doing it. The right way of getting it across is with relation to particular issues, when people actually present clearly sorting out whatever the issue is. And then people know, I'm going to my local council.
Interesting, yeah. It is about that experience
So
in many
it
ways
is,
of it, rather than,
I mean, you, Andrew, are probably better placed than anyone to explain to the populace how the system of government works in the UK. I suspect even if you had people on a 3-week course, some of them would come out still not understanding it.
I used to be. I'm not so sure anymore. Sorry, councillors.
Yeah, so again, people, formal decision making is simpler, isn't it? You have a meeting, you put your hands up and everything.
Yeah.
The bits where citizens who are not elected are involved is more complicated. So, is there a value added in that sense? Getting the wider community, our community is better placed to do some of the things that traditional councils have done.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Not least, councils can vary an answer, but they can't have a bespoke answer, because there's no point in organising it and having one solution if it's completely bespoke.
I suppose the other thing is in terms of making sure that where resources are used, wherever that is from, is done properly. Is there a lighter touch way of doing it? I mean, we seem to have fairly, as a council, have fairly robust audit processes. We have internal audit. Some of that for community groups where you're spending 20, 30 quid, providing teas and coffees can be a bit sledgehammer to crack.
So to a degree, Andrew, and forgive me if I've misunderstood you, but I think the question is based on an assumption that money is the resource. And I think, right or wrong, we still have an awful lot of money to spend, relatively speaking. But the amount of that money which is discretionary, when you look at the number of vulnerable people there are, isn't that high. So actually I think there's far more resource in the community than is available to community benefit.
So actually when you're using that resource, then actually governance would be different anyway.
Completely different.
Because actually persuading somebody to do something for themselves or for the neighbour, there is no mechanism for checking, well, you didn't do what you said you were going to do.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
So it has to, as you're suggesting, be a completely different way of doing business, which is much more based on ownership than it is on permission and authority.
That fits in with some of the evidence about persuasion
Yeah.
and influence, which works both ways. Communities influencing decisions that affect them, but also councils as facilitators actually influencing communities to.
Yeah. So how do we do that? I think there's some really interesting models around a local contract between local people, communities, councils, and other providers. Because I think that to my mind, one of the things that's got a little bit lost is that sense of responsibility in communities for things. If you're always looking to the council to sort things out, and I think it's a really difficult area, but there are some interesting experiments around the country, and they are experiments about how you try and firstly go through a process of co-production of getting to outcomes that are shared, but then trying to codify relative responsibilities for things. And Andrew, you talked about being at the forefront and being brave. Actually, some of those councils have had a lot of derision for some of the things they've tried to do. So I think Andrew's right. We have to look at it in a completely different way. Start in the community and work out, rather than starting with the organisation and trying to work back in.
I just wondered if you'd had any, I appreciate this is quite an awkward question, but looking at the press angle on the council as a body, obviously there's two separate interests here. The press obviously needs our papers, and anything that happens with the council or any slight risk that's taken that doesn't quite work in our favour, if we try and do something new that could be positive, the press seem to be there ready to jump on it and make it front page, which then impacts on the relationship that citizens of Kirklees have with the council. I think most of us spoke to people outside on the street right now. The assumption is that the majority of people are overpaid, get rid of the layers of management, and that the main problem with the council in terms of its spending is actually there's too much waste, which I think is a lot of how people feel about it. I certainly don't think that's true, but I think people do get away with the teas and coffees and less training days and various things, and there's your problem solved. So I just wondered if we could say wave the magic wand, what would the relationship between the council and the press look like to actually make it less sensational and actually have a greater understanding there?
So I think, Jim, as you said, all of the media is a business, and they need to generate turnover. They're there to provide news, but they're also there to sell advertising, and that's the way in which they can employ people. So we're never going to shift that essential contradiction, because there is a need for the free press to work, that they actually fund. They fund their news capacity. I think what we can do and do is to be really clear about a rational message. So when I first joined the council, the first thing we did was to significantly reduce the senior management structure of the council, and we're doing it again. We are very transparent about where we spend our money. It comes back to that information age. If people are genuinely engaged and interested, they don't need to make up their mind about what they think of the council by reading a local newspaper. And I think increasingly over time, as people get used to that, that's what will happen, and that's why newspapers are failing, and that's why they're getting more and more. More and more sensationalist in the way that they report even very small things. So, what we can do is to have the best relationship we can with them. I always say, if you can get past the picture and the headline and actually read the content of the story, they're not that bad actually. They do a pretty good job, and for somewhere like Kirklees, it is really important in terms of just the fabric of society that there is local news media which is reporting what's going on. So I sort of see it as an essential contradiction. I think we need to tell the rational story better and more, but this comes back to the contradiction as well, because if you say to people out there, we employ people to have a communications relationship with the media, so they're the first people they'll want out the door because they're not doing a proper job. So it's relationship based. It's on not relying on the media to get the message out, but having the media as a way of triangulating what the message is. And then crucially, I think, and we can do far more on this, it's about if councillors are at the forefront of that interaction with local people, we can be much better at getting the information to councillors that they need in ways that they can use and access it. But I don't think there's anything broken with the local media. I think there's also an important distinction between media which has a specific and overriding interest and more general media which is serving a population. And I know you're talking to the media in a session if you haven't done it already, so I'll leave it there.
We've yet to speak to them yet. They're not being. I think probably the polite way is not too enthusiastic at engaging is probably the best way.
No, well, so one or two of them, have a particular view of both some local councillors and some council officers. So I'll leave it.
And me as well, apparently. There you go.
It's just a slight. I mean, that is we talked. It's about looking at how things have changed over time, and particularly in Huddersfield, the relationship with the Huddersfield Examiner, which was set up as a campaigning newspaper in the 19th century. Had a tradition and heritage, and actually, Christopher Dix, who is a former editor of the Huddersfield Examiner, sat on the neighbourhood renewal decision-making panel along with Barry South, the divisional commander, and actually he was one of the two people who were there as non-councillors involved in decision-making and changing. And I think that has changed over time with how, given the pressure that local media are under and the groups that they now form a part of, and actually it might be worth engaging that sort of dialogue with them.
But I think at least the local press are, organised, and there are people you can talk to. Going on to, social media, it is by its nature unstructured, and it's actually, so on the one hand we can get clear message out through social media, but what people say about that is almost wholly unregulated. With the local media, you have a structured way of telling them that they're either being fair or unfair, and we can have a different focus.
So conversation is mediated to a certain extent, and so it gives it shape, whereas often social media is unregulated and loses that kind of cogency. I just want to think about this role of the councillor changing a little more, the idea of being a representative, a neighbour, a facilitator, a networker, and often an advocate. In some senses, that change in role has implications for party politics, which I wouldn't expect you to have a particularly strong view on, but also in terms of the relationship between the civil service and councillors. And the wider sort of environment in which the Democracy Commission is taking place is that there has been obviously a reduction in funding to local government that has caused local authorities to have to reduce the size of their civil service, and also that policy-making capacity at the same time as more responsibility for making decisions has been passed down. I just wonder whether you'd like to say something about to a certain extent there is a contradiction in that. There would appear to be some contradiction in the way central government's aims and objectives, but also in the implications for this change in role.
So I think if you call public administration the civil service, then it has profound implications for the way that public servants fulfil their roles. Because as local councillors, so use the councillors as an example, as local councillors become, which I think they have to, more focused on that community relationship, community brokering role, it could lead to the officer corps more setting the policy agenda with less resource and without an effective link back to communities. It's just something we have to guard against. And I think going back to where I was talking about, I think local intelligence and evidence becomes as important as sort of pure policy and thoughts and ideas and strategies. And Andrew asked earlier about what could we do. I think we actually have to put resource as a bureaucracy into a different space, which is supporting some of those community-based conversations as much as the policy and evidence. But at a time when you're making organisations much smaller, that's a really, really hard thing to do. And what it's creating is a gap. So it's one we're conscious of, and the only answer to it is to shift civil service resource in the way that you talked it, out of decision making into support, practical community and other work. So in other words, we've got to get our decision making much slicker. There need to be less long papers written in a learning way with options in them. But within the legal framework in local government, that's where you can be challenged and get things wrong. So, it's actually quite a risky thing to take a lot of support out of the, just the mechanism decision making and putting it into supporting that community brokering role. I think that's what we need to do.
It does seem, and Professor Taylor this morning was suggesting that there is a disconnect between the reform of local government in terms of representation and those power structures and civil service architecture in Whitehall and whatever it manifests. Do you think there's
But I think this is an area where it does need resource in the form of money to be able to plug the gap that we're talking about.
You beat me to the point there.
Yeah, it's interesting to get this dynamic between local government and central government, and sometimes we're having to implement grudgingly or really the central government policy. And it's, again, if we're looking at the whole thing from top to bottom, what's the better way of local government actually being the core of what happens in the country, actually driving the agenda? So that could be about the economic, we talk about economic resilience, let's talk about that, linking into health and well-being, but the vast amount of resource otherwise is actually still directed from Westminster. Perhaps we have got a better understanding of our businesses, actually people are employed or unemployed, the skills and stuff that link with the schools, colleges, universities. So how can we make that as a building block for what happens in the country?
And I think we talked about devolution earlier on, didn't we? In truth, what's happening is a devolution. Well, it's a decentralisation of money and a certain amount of increased freedom within a nationally set policy agenda. So, in what is a very centralised democracy, the only way of achieving that actually is to convince sufficient MPs that this is a better way of doing business. That sounds defeatist, but even the strongest and most effective council that pulled this off, would, I think, get insufficient traction to bring around that seismic shift you were talking about. Going back to a previous question, though, maybe there is a way of getting MPs to much more closely align with the interests of local people through their local council, because they very much, most of them, take an advocate role as opposed to a solutions role. Not all, but most.
Yeah. And that's knitted together
So,
with all the representatives.
I mean, it was implicit in what we were talking about before, but I think you can't actually change and refocus the role of a local councillor in Kirklees without working through the relationships with MPs.
Again, an area which I feel hasn't been particularly considered in any detail. I think it's
Well, so with the Boundary Commission proposals at the moment, it would on paper look less complicated to have 4 coterminous MPs with one district than 5 and 2 shared with other districts, and maybe that has to be one of the principles for any Boundary Commission review.
That's remarkable. But as a citizen of Greater Manchester, the boundary review actually means some MPs will now reach outside of the metropolitan borough of Greater Manchester. It seems I think here in many ways. To move on, because one of your most formal public roles is an returning officer, and
Yep.
that obviously gives you notoriety on election evenings. Obviously, there seems to be some concern about the introduction of the directly elected mayors in central government at the moment, whether that means that they will materialise in West Yorkshire or in Greater Yorkshire, Lesser Yorkshire, whatever Yorkshire materialises, is by the by. There is a growing trend to hold various elections on the same day. Now, for some people, they assume that's a good thing for local democracy because there tends to be a boost in turnout, particularly with Parliament and Westminster elections. For others, there is a sense in which this complicates and it maybe devalues local democracy.
Yeah.
I wonder whether you have anything to say about this trend, is assuming it is going to continue because it seems to be cost effective for nothing else, has implications for the local authority and the resonance of local democracy as compared to other forms.
So in general terms, I think it's really unhelpful to run multiple elections on the same day. Our experience, or our staff's experience in polling stations, is that people are predominantly there for one election. And a lot of people go as far as to ask how they should vote with respect to whatever the other ballot papers are, which of course they can't do and wouldn't do. And actually I think that's what leads to the number of spoiled ballot papers you get in some elections. Actually people have gone along for one reason, they've been asked to do something else, they're really not interested, so they don't bother. And I think similar elections, so for example town and parish council with district elections, there's quite a strong reason for doing, because you've sometimes got a lot of candidates who are involved in both and they're really quite local. I wouldn't actually run parliamentary elections in conjunction with district council elections for all of the reasons that we were talking about earlier, and I think the very real frustration that local politicians have about the fact that they're standing on a local mandate, albeit for a political party, but actually the vote will be determined by whatever's going on in national politics, going back to Andrew's question. I just think it doesn't help.
It diminishes the resonance.
Well, it diminishes the resonance of the importance of the person who's standing as well as the party, particularly in local elections. And then if you add to that technical referenda on things that people have varying levels of interest in, I think it just dilutes democracy to hold multiple elections on the same day.
It's interesting because I was, before I came up here, I was with the Huddersfield Student Union and talking to them about the Democracy Commission, about the relationship with Kirklees Council. And one of the things that came up is a complaint which is often heard, which is that the May dates on which elections are held are deeply problematic for the sizable student population across Kirklees, not only those that go to the University of Huddersfield but go to the university. And that's why we see such a poor turnout of 18 to 24-year-olds, as they tend to be either very confused about where they are, what their jurisdiction is, where they can vote, but also the fact is that they tend to be extremely busy, they're in transit from exams or whatever. Do you think that there is a potential argument to shift the day away from May for elections? Is there or put it another way, is there a need to consistently hold these elections in May?
No. I think it's convention and financial years, isn't it? So all of those things could be changed. Universities don't have a financial year end of the 31st of March, so councils don't have to, governments don't have to. I think perhaps more importantly though is starting with the objective of getting turnout up and then considering all of the factors that might dissuade people from turning out an election. And the one you've mentioned is really important, but there are a number of others. So I think it's a question of looking at all of those factors, not simply the 18 to 24 vote, although clearly encouraging young people to get involved in democracy at the earliest possible opportunity, and actually before they're 18, I think is the way to go. And I'm a strong advocate personally of the vote being at 16 rather than 18, and I think there are a lot of things we could do then, working with schools and other institutions to get across the vibrancy of local democracy.
I was going to come on to a number of questions around that, which the vote to 16 issue was one. A number of other suggestions have come up with our public consultations about how you could increase voter turnout. Moving the day of polling to Saturday was one suggestion. Online voting has become increasingly popular as a suggestion. Do you have any opinion on the desirability of that and the feasibility?
Well, I think this is an area where there's a number of dilemmas. There are a number of trade-offs between the integrity of the poll and its accessibility. But if you can do online banking successfully online, I don't see why you shouldn't be able to vote online. And in some ways, if the actual security of whatever the mechanism was could be cracked, it would be probably more secure than things like postal voting, where individual votes are sent to a household, which is a collective setting. So I think yes, it would need to be very secure, but that shouldn't be beyond the wit of man.
Or woman. One of the big issues has been, it's come back to on a number of occasions, has been the potential change to the cycle elections, and with very strong views supporting the maintenance of the status quo, which is the 3 and 4 cycle, or moving to all out elections after 4 years, or even recently suggested that there would be, by one of the Victoria MPs, that you go to a 5-year cycle. I don't know if you have any opinion on that and how it might impact on Kirklees Council if there was a change.
So I do, and I need to make it really clear throughout all of this that this is a personal opinion. But if you start with the logic of what I said about clear outcomes as being a way that you can secure input from councillors across the spectrum, it follows that you need time to make a difference to some really long-term underlying issues. You can't crack underlying poverty and ambition achievement on a yearly cycle. You can deliver services to a yearly cycle, but you can't affect change to a yearly cycle.
So you're saying it affects the strategic capacity?
So it actually affects the strategic capacity of the council to achieve the outcomes it thinks are important. Because what 3 and 4 elections tend to encourage is incrementalism and putting stuff off until next year, things which are either important or difficult. I strongly believe that if any administration could stand on a 4-year ticket of saying, I've got 4 years, this is what I'm going to do, and having that 4-year, the local government could have far more impact on people's lives than it does at the moment. I fully accept the very practical reasons why people think that's a bad idea, particularly in terms of the mechanisms of how elections work and and the amount of party machinery that goes into turning people out to vote. There's a strong view across parties that says if you don't have an annual process for getting your troops out on the street, then they'll have forgotten how to do it by year 4. Now, that's a very real consideration when you want a vibrant democracy. But it comes back to my point about what local government's for. If it's about delivering services which are incrementally changed, elections 3 years in 4 are fine. If it's about setting really clear outcomes and making a really big impact on people's lives, I think it should be a 4-year term. I think there are connected issues then about the way that local government's funded, council tax, business rates, and a whole load of other things. But that's my personal view.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, just to explore that a bit, because obviously, even with the 4-year cycle, some of the changes we're talking about are generational. We're talking about 15, 20 years to achieve those outcomes as well. So, to do that, I mean, and I suppose the other thing is electoral system, because we've got in Scotland and Northern Ireland, we've got single transferable vote on a 4-year cycle, but you actually still get a great deal of stability from election to election. You get much less, fewer swings, I think. I suppose the other thing about electoral cycle, you saw that particularly in the 90s and the early 2000s when you got, well, I mean, Derbyshire County Council's the classic. It'd been Labour for 30, 40 years, and then the Tories running, and all of a sudden, you know, got the Tories running Derbyshire for the first time in 40 years, and it was quite a shock to the system. So I understand that, but different electoral system, more stability with that.
So I think a different electoral system actually could, also help with the achievement of outcomes to longer term. But I don't think by itself it would necessarily make that change. I mean, in somewhere like Kirklees, where actually I would argue that all things being equal, it's very difficult for any political party to achieve an overall majority. If the only thing that were changed with the electoral system, what that might just do is, reinforce underlying instability. Because, and that's why I say start. If your job is about, or if the objective is about achieving really important outcomes, so I'll take one that I'm personally passionate about. So for the whole time I've been involved in the council, and for probably 20 years longer than that, we've had an objective around looked after children having the same life chances as other children, about them not being neat, and we've done all sorts of things, but we haven't really shifted that on. And actually it needs really long-term programmes sustained over a long period, and 4 years may not be long enough, but it gives a much better chance of staying with the sustained set of programmes which could be part of a manifesto and followed through. So for me, Andrew, the electoral system by itself wouldn't change that. So it's the outcomes focus which I think dictates having a longer cycle. Maybe it's not 4 years, maybe it's 3, maybe it's 5, but it's longer than 3 years in 4.
Just to move on, one of the things that has come up in our consultations across Kirklees and also with stakeholders who've come to the inquiries here is the importance of civic identity, in the sense about the way in which civic identity shapes a sense of citizenship and connection between local authorities and communities. And often the point has been made that Kirklees obviously is a product of 1974, it's a relatively recent entity, and therefore, although it may be well generational, younger generations may not have the same issues as the old generations, but there is an issue around Kirklees as a civic institution in the sense of that bondedness and connection between citizens. I suppose the two questions is A, how important do you think that bond is? And B, is it problematic that some citizens do not feel that sense of identity to Kirklees and often frame it at a lower level or at a higher level, that Kirklees sort of doesn't resonate?
I think it is an issue to a degree. I mean, I think that civic connection is really important. But it's interesting that I think the truly civic part of Kirklees, which is the mayor, actually all communities identify with the mayor of Kirklees, and there's a brilliant and vibrant civic relationship with everybody. And it doesn't matter with government, where Kirklees is a brand, which is, you've talked about some of it earlier in terms of being proactive and actually being a place which is quite typical of most of the country in one way, shape or form. Where it matters is where different communities and places don't think that they belong and look back to something that they had in the past which they think was better. I bet they hated whatever it was they had in the past, though. So there's that thing about how you look forward and are confident around what is a brand. And the success of Kirklees is a collection of places which are different, where the sum of parts is greater than their individual. And there's some really strong identities that come out of that. They will never be as strong as the identity of quite small places that are quite competitive. But it doesn't mean you can't have a wider civic focus for Kirklees. So it does matter, and I quite often say I'm the only person who loves Kirklees, and that's because I'm paid to love it. But when you go to the substance of what it does for people, I think actually you can win that argument. The trick is not to talk about Dewsbury or Huddersfield or Heckman-Wyke or Cleckheaton or Marsden or Colne Valley, because that then means something else to whoever you're talking about, not necessarily the same thing.
Goes back to that notion of place.
So it is an artificial construct, but so is every other council in the country at some point in its history. So get over it.
Imagine communities and invented traditions. Very true indeed.
I think, I can't remember, two of our politicians across different groups said something like, Kirklees has only been with us for 40 years, so let's think about what it is rather than what it isn't. It's not exactly what they said, but it was something like that.
Because one of the things that is interesting about when we've been talking to different groups of citizens is that the younger citizens do not see it as a problematic relationship in the same way. And in part that is a banal experience, that they know nothing different. But there is a sense in which they also buy into it through their education and their interactions with the council in a different sense. I'm just wondering to what extent you would think about this problem of the lack of understanding what the council does about what councillors do, how important education could be in possibly inculcating a sense of Kirkleesness, if we want to call it that.
So I think that's self-evidently true, and I think there's a sense of frustration in young people that comes through from them individually and through the institutions that they attend of a willingness to engage, but not necessarily knowing how to or in what way. So you talked earlier about the University Students' Union. Actually, Students' Union has been really helpful to me as returning officer in getting students to enrol and understand some of the complexities of how they can get involved in the democratic process. So I think you're absolutely right that that's a way to go, and as an organisation that has relationships with schools, there's far more we could do. Also comes back to your point though about the capacity and resources that are available and how much of a priority that is. So I think that could be transformational. If it's a political priority, then it's something we could do far more.
I think it's also a question of co-production. I think that's ideal.
No, indeed.
The university certainly is realising more and more its role as a civic institution.
Yeah. So I think the important part in that question is the civic part, and the mayor is an example of how actually people can get beyond their very local identities of place.
I think it'd be worth just going back to what we were talking. Keep going back to these outcomes. I mean, I agree with what you're saying, because actually that's one of the things we've tried to do quite in our patch, talking about going back to the neighbourhood renewal, health, education, environment, employment, safety. And actually a lot of hard work to get our communities to say, if you're working within that framework, you'll achieve. And Kirklees is just a mean to it. So if you wanted that economic resilience, it's how does your sense of identity of place actually work to improve that? And it's still those models. So if you're looking at how do I generate employment within my village or my town, can we use that? And Kirklees is just a means to an end, isn't it?
So I think that's a really good example. So if you take employment as an illustration and as a district, so what are the predominant features of labour markets in Kirklees? Manufacturing, commuting, health and social care, education. Now, some of those things are quite local supply chains, so bits of the engineering manufacturing sector. Some of them are more sub-regional. You know, the commuting one, it doesn't matter which people's skills are or whether people go to Leeds or Manchester. Different set of factors that drive, and that comes us back to Kirklees has a place in this. There's a sub-regional level to what we should be doing about employment and skills, because there needs to be a consistency of access. But what's important in higher level skills and technical education in Kirklees does look different to what it looks like in Bradford or somewhere else. So we've got to have these tiers, and Kirklees has an important civic role in that. So at the level of the university, the college, our two CCGs, what I call Team Kirklees, and where people work for those institutions, you can get a real focus on place and civic purpose. Coming back to, though, what's the evidence, what's different about the population needs in this space, in this place. So there's a bit about, it's different in the Colne Valley because, but it's also the same in the Colne Valley because, and it's about cutting it at the right level, Andrews.
I think that's because the democracy needs to work for the whole patch, the system needs to work for the whole patch, doesn't it? So some of the tension, in the same way we chunter about Westminster, and that's the easy thing for all of us to do, and about the politicians down there. The concern in Kirklees is about Huddersfield, Dewsbury, Batley, isn't it? All those centralisation of resources. In West Yorkshire, I think believe, right or wrong, that Leeds gets everything and you're not going up to the arms. You just need a mechanism to get, the mechanism to get people to engage in that and to actually understand although things might be happening differently.
Well, there's one challenge in sort of this conversation that we've not talked about. It does touch back on local people. If you stand back and look at our councillors, and in some ways our council officers, actually we're all getting older. There's a lot of councillors who've been on the council a very long time.
You predicted my next question, which is going to be, how do we attract the next generation?
Well, so I think that is the absolute challenge. Against the background of everything else we've talked about, that is the absolute challenge, because it ought to be something that if people want to make a real impact, that they consider. And I think it's talking. I talk to as many young people as anyone else. It's not seen now as the way in which you change things. I don't think becoming a local councillor. There are exceptions, and that we've had a lot of change on the council. Actually, there are a lot of new councillors. So I'm not necessarily talking about young councillors. I am talking about new councillors who haven't been involved in it for a long time. But they may be 75 years old and wanting in their later life to make a huge contribution, but it's that feature of not being on the council for 40 years and looking forward as much as looking
Would you
back.
introduce a limited number of terms?
No. But I think because you shouldn't, in some ways that would be discriminatory. If you've got a councillor who's been on the council for 40 years and has exactly the same number of ambition and dynamism and connection as they had 40 years ago, then they shouldn't be disenfranchised from staying as a councillor. But we need to support councillors so that they are like that if they've been on the council for a long while.
So there's some kind of performance indicator.
Yeah. So there is a thing about, without introducing formal performance management for councillors by their groups, there is something about a feedback mechanism which looks at the impact that councillors have and actually sees how they're playing in the team and which bit they're fulfilling and what impact they're having. That's not for council officers to do. I think it's something that political parties and councillors have to do for themselves, but I think it has to be part of achieving impact for the long term.
Yeah, well, we did touch on this. I mean, both building on what Roger Russell said yesterday and Andrew Taylor said this morning about outcomes based, and actually we're talking about the role profiles for councillors, and that can just be a tick box. So I've done so many surgeries, I've spoken to so many residents, I've done this, that, turned up to so many meetings, but so what you said there, and actually we talked on this morning, one of the things that we found, when we would be most successful representing our ward, it was like, what are the issues that matter? What are the important issues for our patch? And it could have been health or education, and then how do those play into the strategic outcomes, for knitting those into the issues that for day to day all the G's been battling. But how do you assess in that outcome-based approach?
Well,
different. You can't tick box to say that council is representing.
No, you can't, and you can't argue with the ballot box either. So if someone has gone back time after time after time, they're doing something which is appealing to local people. But I do think it's about supporting councillors to do the development they want to do and the right development for their role, and giving a feedback mechanism as to how that works. As I say, it's not for me to do, it's not for any officer to do. But
yeah, I think the other thing that Andrew Taylor talks, it was on the news yesterday about post-Brexit and one of the problems with democracy in the UK about safe constituent, hundreds of constituencies, parliamentary constituencies up and down the country where who's going to get in, lack of effort, and I think one of the positives for those who love politics, it's the process, isn't it? And actually talking to somebody with different views from myself, I found it's that we've had conversation, about stuff, and whoever that is, and it's whether the process facilitates that. And it is risky as a politician to put yourself online to actually have a robust discussion with residents, both people who are not going to vote for you. But that does lead to better decisions being made, that dynamic.
Yeah, I think the power of local government is its councillors and its politicians. It's not its services or its bureaucrats. Because the way things are stitched together locally at Kirklees level, that is all dependent on a quality of political discussion. We should none of us forget that. It's about how we support the quality of that, and how we engage as many local people to see the benefit of that as possible. Because I think we're an increasingly anti-establishment world, aren't we? So
I'm not quite sure, because it seems to be establishment that's leading the anti-establishment movement.
That's a very long conversation.
Yes.
But there's a power in politics to set the ambition for the future rather than deal with just the difficulties of today. Yeah.
Do you think that councillors are remunerated appropriately?
No. So I think this is part of the anti-establishment thing I was talking about just now. So I think being realistic, if people who are going to make a difference and who are prepared to put themselves forward and develop themselves, I think need to be fairly rewarded for the impact that they have. Now, I don't think they're desperately under-rewarded, but I do think they're under-rewarded. And I think there's a bit about, we've gone into a world where we've got executive councillors who are leading who get paid more, and other councillors who, and I've argued that a community broking role is the most important role. I think they should be better remunerated for that, but in a context where there is a check on quality and impact. So I think the general effective councillor should be able to earn some more within a quality framework which political parties and groups should establish and assess.
Just perhaps you'd comment, the new councillors, and we've got significantly more new councillors who are working full time than certainly when I was elected 12 years ago. Again, it was mainly people who got part time, and that to me seems to have an impact. What potentially could you do about remuneration to help people who are in full time were earning significantly more than they would be getting for an allowance? Other ways of doing. Whereas for some people, it's a top up to a pension, isn't it?
Yes. So I gave evidence to our independent remuneration panel for councillors. I was making similar points to the ones that we've just made. So I think we do want, or local people ought to want, a whole range of experiences, professions, people who work, people who don't work, because that's reflective of our communities in the round. So we ought to make it easier for people to get released from work for a time so they can get more engaged. I wouldn't want to get to the point though where a number of councillors give up work in order just to do this. You need a mix, and it's kind of accidental what that mix is, isn't it? And there must be a right mix, and I think that's the way to try and think about it.
There's potentially a link between somebody what work, full-time work they are doing, and reimbursing the employers so they're not missing out.
But I think that's an essentially it's an issue for political parties about how they, both what they think that right mix looks like and how they go about getting it and how they select candidates. But part of that is what it should be possible to earn if you're doing it well. But I would put more focus on the community brokering side of it than the I'm a full-time politician running an administration.
Who's valuing different contributions equally,
exactly.
And accepting that there are different contributions, yes. I think that somewhat goes towards this notion of valuing part-time status as well, the fact that you bring in a different background of councillors through that wider optionality.
But I think it's very difficult for one council to address those sorts of issues. I think there needs to be, it's really a national debate about what is the value of councillors and how they should be rewarded. There's a certain amount of local discretion clearly to have a different scheme, but I think you'd all get pilloried for it if it was too out of line. So.
I think that's true. Well, I'm looking at the time and I realise that you are a very busy man, so I think unless you have any more questions that thank you very much for your time. From my own personal experience, the one thing that I found is most lauded about Kirklees Council is it has continued to invest in young people, and particularly in the youth council, at a time when it's probably easier to not do so. And I think it genuinely shows a sense about the way in which the council does value local democracy. As you well know, we're going to carry on now until the end of October, taking evidence from a variety of stakeholders. We're then going to go away and draw some conclusions from the extensive amount of data we've collected, which could take some time. We've been talking to all our stakeholders, and we've been to the general public, and we're very clear that this Commission is a conversation. It's not simply that we interact on a one-off basis and disappear and publish a report without that kind of bilateral and dialogical element to it. And in that sense, that we would like and hope that when we come to some conclusions in a draft format, that we'll be sending that out to all those that are given the time, that you would be kind enough to comment and feedback on the conclusions that we draw. I think it's on behalf of the Commission as a whole, we're very grateful for the support that yourself in your personal capacity and the Council has given towards the Democracy Commission. We genuinely feel that there is a commitment to this, and it makes our work a lot easier to undertake.
So this is one of the things that I think is brilliant for the future. Actually, new council can't work without democracy being refreshed and councillors wanting to take it forward in a completely different way. So actually, the conclusions the Commission draws and their debate and acceptance or not, or partial acceptance, is crucial to the rest of the new council projects.
I think one of the most encouraging things has been, is from everyone that I've spoken to, and as someone coming from the outside of the institution inside, is that they see this as the beginning of something rather than in itself an end. And I think that that's rewarding. That I don't think this Commission will provide the panacea to all the ills of local democracy, but I think that as a progressive and cognitive approach, I think that it is highly encouraging. And once again, it underlines the fact that Kirklees does take local democracy seriously, and in that sense, your attendance here underlines that. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.